Welcome back, and prepare yourself for a story that has remained hidden in shadow for over a century. Claire Duchamp, a meticulous archivist in New Orleans, had spent years handling documents and photographs that others considered mundane, but nothing had prepared her for the water-stained box delivered to her office one rainy afternoon. The box, wrapped in brittle brown paper, bore no return address, only a faint scrawl, "For history, if you dare." Her fingers trembled as she untied the string, revealing its contents: a collection of yellowed letters, a pair of delicate silk gloves, and a single framed wedding portrait, dust-smudged and fading at the edges. The photograph captured a young bride, poised yet strangely uneasy. Her veil, unusually thick and heavy, cast subtle shadows over her face, obscuring her eyes and the corners of her mouth. At first glance, it appeared a typical early 20th century studio portrait, but something about the weight of the veil, the tilt of her head, and the stiffness in her posture made Claire pause. It was as if the portrait itself carried a warning. The delicate lace and the satin gown spoke of wealth and refinement, yet the bride's hands, clenched lightly at her waist, suggested tension, even fear. Claire ran her fingertips along the edges of the photograph. Despite the years, the emotion captured in that single frame seemed palpable, almost suffocating. Her curiosity, both professional and deeply personal, ignited an urgent need to understand. Who was she? Why had this portrait been preserved in secrecy, away from the gaze of family albums or public archives? There was no inscription, no date, just the silent stare of a woman whose story seemed trapped in shadow. Claire knew that this image was more than a photograph. It was a puzzle, a whisper of a past someone had tried to bury. Determined to uncover the truth, Claire set up her scars, onning equipment, adjusting light and focus to capture every subtle detail. Even through the digital enhancement, the veil remained oppressive, and now faint traces of tears could be seen along the bride's cheek, almost invisible to the naked eye. There was a bruise, a shadow of something darker hidden beneath the carefully constructed elegance of her appearance. The discovery left Claire with an icy certainty. This bride's life had been far from the idyllic tale suggested by her gown and veil. Someone had gone to great lengths to conceal her suffering, and this photograph was a rare surviving testament. Before we continue with the story and unspeakable secrets, I want to ask something important. This channel is not for everyone. Only the bravest souls who dare to confirm the darkest chapters of American history. If you made it this far, you are not like most people. You understand some truths are too horrifying to ignore, no matter how much they disturb us. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you brave enough to hear a story like this from your own backyard? Next, we discover what lies beneath the veil, as Claire begins a painstaking investigation into the bride's identity and the shadows lurking behind her forced smile. The morning sunlight slanted through the high windows of the New Orleans Historical Collection, dust motes floating in golden beams, but Claire Duchamp barely noticed. Her focus remained on the wedding portrait, now scanned and enlarged on the digital monitor. Each pixel seemed to carry fragments of the bride's anguish. She could trace the delicate lace of the veil, the pearl accents on the gown, and, most disturbingly, the faint wet streaks along the woman's cheeks. Claire leaned closer, her breath catching. The bride had cried, yet this was no ordinary tear. There was an urgency, a silent plea embedded in the fabric of the photograph. She pressed her fingers to her lips, a shiver running down her spine. Whoever this woman had been, she had suffered, and her torment had been meticulously preserved in the studio's lens. Claire knew she needed expertise beyond her own. Marcus Reed, a veteran photographic restorer, had handled delicate images before, but nothing like this. Marcus examined the image on his high-resolution screen, his brow furrowed. "The veil is dense, layered. It's hiding more than it should," he murmured, fingers dancing over the keyboard to enhance the shadows. Gradually the bride's face emerged, a ghostly visage of despair. Claire's stomach tightened. Tears, yes, but beneath them, faint discoloration, subtle but unmistakable, like a shadowed bruise. Her instincts screamed, this was not the wedding joy the photographer was paid to capture. They continued refining the image, adjusting contrast, mid-tones, and shadow details. Every tweak revealed more of the hidden story. Marcus paused, whispering, "Look at her eyes. See the tension around the jaw? This isn't fear of the photograph. She's terrified of something else entirely." Claire nodded, unable to tear her gaze away. It was as if the woman had left a silent message, a frozen scream hidden beneath layers of lace. The veil, once intended to shield her, now amplified her desperate, unspoken story. The next step was to identify her. Claire began combing the historical archives, marriage ledgers, and estate records, piecing together the social web of New Orleans elite. Every name, every address, every recorded payment could reveal a thread leading to the bride's identity. Weeks passed in meticulous research. Names began to emerge: Devoux, Thornton, prominent families, wealthy estates, hidden debts, and social expectations that might have forced a young woman into a life she hadn't chosen. Claire noted the repetition of unusual phrases in the studio ledger, mentions of special sitting arrangements, and requests for extra veil coverage. Each detail compounded the sense of unease. As the days wore on, Claire realized this portrait was not a relic of fashion or celebration. It was evidence, an unintentional document of control, coercion, and perhaps violence. The photograph had survived more than a century, quietly bearing witness while its subject remained invisible to history. Claire's pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down. This was more than academic inquiry. It was uncovering the truth behind a life silenced, a story deliberately hidden beneath silk and lace. Next, we follow Claire as she uncovers the ledger entries and journal notes that reveal a wedding day steeped in fear, secrets, and a social facade hiding unspeakable cruelty. Claire's fingers traced the delicate ink of the Lavo studio ledger, each line of the 1904 entries carrying echoes of lives long past. The New Orleans sun had shifted hours ago, but she barely noticed, absorbed in a web of names, dates, and notes that could unravel the mystery of the veiled bride. On June 18, 1904, one entry stood out. Wedding portrait, Miss Emily DeVoe and Mr. Robert Thornton. 4 plates exposed, special sitting arrangement, payment received in advance. Claire read the words aloud, tasting their significance. The phrase special sitting arrangement was unusual, even alarming, hinting at conditions beyond the ordinary expectations of a society wedding. Her pulse quickened. Simone Bertrand, the archives director, leaned over the ledger with her glasses perched precariously. The Lavo family were meticulous. They recorded every detail, including notes about difficult sittings or unusual client requests, she explained. Claire's eyes drifted to the studio journal, smaller and leather-bound, its pages filled with Jean-Baptiste Lavo's flowing handwriting. June 19, 1904. Yesterday's sitting troubles my conscience. Miss Emily appeared pale, eyes red. Madame Devoux insisted we proceed immediately. Veil must remain forward. The bride trembled. Fear, not excitement. Mr. Thornton maintained possession of her shoulder, grip firm, controlling. I exposed 4 plates to hasten their departure. I fear for her, yet can do nothing. Claire's stomach twisted. The words were stark, almost unbearable in their clarity. Through the photographer's eyes, she could see the fear, the silent plea. The veil had not been a fashion statement. It had been a shield, deliberately arranged to hide the marks of abuse. The groom's hand, possessive and controlling, had tightened whenever Emily moved, a subtle but unmistakable display of power. Every sentence in the journal etched a mental image more vivid than the photograph itself. Claire could almost feel the tension in the air of that studio, smell the faint perfume of lilies and waxed floors, and hear the stiff shuffle of shoes against polished wood. Claire, the ledger notes that payments were substantial, Simone said quietly. This wasn't just any wedding. The Devoux family had wealth, but there's a hint of urgency. Perhaps financial desperation played a role in this union. Claire nodded, the pieces beginning to fit together. The family's social standing, combined with mounting financial strain, could have made them vulnerable to Thornton's manipulation. Emily, young and talented, had been sacrificed in a transaction dressed as marriage. Every detail, from the heavy veil to the tension in the photographer's writing, painted a picture of coercion. Claire shivered. This was no simple social arrangement. It was a trap, meticulously documented by a man who could see wrong but was bound by the limits of propriety and the law of the era. The veil hid more than tears and bruises. It concealed a story of power, manipulation, and fear that had been deliberately left out of public record. Next, we follow Claire as she delves into newspapers, estate records, and shipping manifests, tracking Emily Devoux's journey abroad and uncovering the early steps of a deadly pattern set in motion by Robert Thornton. Claire's eyes scanned the faded columns of the June 1904 edition of the Times-Picayune, her fingers trembling slightly as she followed the neatly printed announcement. Marriage of Miss Emily Celeste Devaux to Mr. Robert Harrison Thornton, ceremony at the Devaux residence June 17th. The couple will reside abroad following the wedding. The brevity of the notice struck her immediately. No mention of the gown, the flowers, the celebration, a perfunctory announcement for a family usually given to social page extravagance. Claire's mind raced. Why the secrecy? Why the hurried departure? Her investigation led her next to shipping manifests, fragile documents preserved in the National Archives. A first-class booking stood out. Mr. and Mrs. R.H. Thornton, departing New York aboard the SS Britannic bound for Liverpool in July 1904. Claire's pulse quickened. Emily had left her home, her family, her city, under the control of a man whose shadow already darkened her wedding portrait. Europe, a continent of opportunity for some, had become a cage for her. Searching through British and French newspaper archives was painstaking. Mentions of the couple were scarce and fleeting. A Parisian society column in October 1904 noted their attendance at a reception hosted by a prominent banking family, but after that they vanished from public record. Claire felt the chill of absence in her veins. Each day abroad, each unrecorded movement, became a void, a silence pregnant with questions. What had Emily endured during those months? Was she happy, as her mother had been told, or trapped under the pretense of propriety? Claire returned repeatedly to the photograph, its veil seeming heavier with each discovery. That single image, captured with the meticulous eye of Jean-Baptiste Lavaux, was the only remaining witness to Emily's fear. The tears, the bruise, the rigid tension in her posture, they were too. Testimonies of a life manipulated and controlled. Claire realized that for all the letters, manifests, and announcements, this photograph spoke a truth that documents alone could not convey. She expanded her search to include the Devaux family. Madame Celeste Devaux had been admitted to a private sanatorium in early 1905, her health deteriorating under the weight of guilt and uncertainty. Doctors' notes described her anguish. She reports no letters from her daughter, fears for her safety, believes Mr. Thornton restricts communication. Claire felt a pang of sorrow. The mother's suffering mirrored her daughter's, compounded by the societal pressures that had made Emily's marriage inevitable. Financial desperation, social expectation, and the insidious charm of Robert Thornton converged into a trap that left Emily isolated in a foreign land. Claire imagined her stepping onto the Britannic, clutching a small travel bag, eyes wide with hope and fear, oblivious to the manipulation that awaited. Every document, every notation strengthened the evidence of coercion and control. Next, Claire would uncover the first traces of Emily's tragic fate, the subtle clues buried in French death records, and the pattern that would later reveal Robert Thornton as far more than a fortune hunter. A web of deceit, fear, and ultimately murder awaited, hidden beneath a veil of respectability and social expectation. Claire sat back in her chair, staring at the scanned images of French records from Nice. Her fingers trembled as she opened the file marked Emily Thornton, January 1906. The official death certificate stared up at her, stark in its simplicity. Cause of death: accidental fall from villa balcony. Filed by Robert Harrison Thornton, Emily's husband. The words blurred as Claire read and reread them, each repetition tightening the knot of dread in her stomach. How many accidents befell young women trapped in marriages that offered wealth to their families but danger to themselves? The veil, the tears, the bruise, it all suddenly made a terrifying, coherent sense. Emily had been silenced, her life extinguished barely 18 months after her wedding. Claire leaned over the documents, absorbing every detail. The burial record confirmed that Emily had been interred in the Protestant section of the Cimetière de Cocarde, a small plot purchased by her husband. No family involvement, no witnesses, only Thornton's name as the certifying authority. The sense of isolation and control was palpable. Emily had been removed entirely from her family's reach, a ghost transported abroad, her death masked as misfortune. Claire reached for her notebook, scribbling connections, timelines, and emerging patterns. Emily's disappearance from society columns, the lack of correspondence with her parents, and the mother's subsequent mental collapse all painted a harrowing picture of systematic coercion. Madame Devaux had been admitted to a sanatorium in early 1905, suffering from severe anxiety and guilt. Her doctor's notes read, "She reports that her daughter is missing, possibly under duress. The patient exhibits severe melancholia and persistent fear." Claire shivered. A mother's anguish, compounded by social and financial constraints, had left her powerless to rescue her child. Every record reinforced the horrifying truth. Robert Thornton's charm, his business acumen, and the veneer of respectability concealed the calculated cruelty beneath. Claire imagined him navigating European cities, orchestrating Emily's life from the shadows, until her untimely death. The veil had hidden more than a bruise. It had hidden the first step in a deadly pattern that would later claim more lives. Claire turned to correspondence from genealogy researcher Elizabeth Parker in London. Parker had discovered the death certificate, confirming the tragic narrative. Claire's hands shook as she contemplated the pattern that would emerge when she tracked Thornton's subsequent marriages. Emily was the first in a series, the initial act of a methodical predator preying on wealthy families desperate to secure financial stability. Claire realized the significance. Emily's photograph, her tears, and her bruise were evidence, silent testimony to coercion, fear, and abuse. This revelation transformed Claire's mission. She was no longer just cataloguing historical photographs or reconstructing family records. She was unearthing a hidden history of predation, giving voice to a young woman whose life had been stolen. Emily's story was just the beginning. The shadows cast by Thornton's hand stretched further, reaching across continents and years. Next, Claire would trace Thornton's later marriages, uncovering the second victim, Grace Worthington, and beginning to map the deadly pattern that had allowed a man to kill with impunity, shielded by society and legality. Claire's research shifted from Emily to Robert Thornton's next conquest. Records indicated that in 1909 he had married Grace Worthington of New York, a young woman from a family recently impoverished by a bank failure. Grace's story, though separated by geography from Emily's, carried the same ominous undertones. Claire traced her life through newspaper mentions, archival letters, and estate records. Grace had been an accomplished painter, her watercolors quietly supporting her family's precarious finances. Her talent, once a source of pride, would soon be overshadowed by Thornton's relentless pursuit of wealth and status. Claire imagined the courtship, Thornton appearing as a benefactor, a savior, someone who could restore the Worthington family's stability. Social records hinted at his charm and persuasive skill. Grace, vulnerable and burdened by familial obligations, was compelled to accept his proposal. Claire's chest tightened as she read letters between Grace and her friends, small fragments preserved in private collections. They spoke of excitement tempered by unease, the fluttering hope of a new life overshadowed by the subtle discomfort of her fiancé's intense attention. Travel documents revealed the couple's departure for their honeymoon in Europe, echoing Emily's path. Claire's fingers traced the ink on a ship's manifest. Thornton again in control of the journey, Grace removed from her familiar environment, isolated in a foreign land. Once abroad, the trail went cold. There were fleeting mentions in society columns, Grace's presence at a reception in Lake Como, brief notes of her husband's business connections, but nothing that indicated domestic stability or happiness. The absence of ordinary correspondence was striking. Then Claire discovered the record that confirmed her worst suspicions. Grace Worthington had drowned in Lake Como 6 months after her marriage. Ostensibly an accident, it mirrored the deceptive finality of Emily's death. Claire compared the circumstances with meticulous attention. Both women had been young, wealthy, and recently married. Both had travelled abroad with Thornton. Both had perished within months, removed from familial oversight. The pattern, once abstract, was now undeniable. Beyond the documents, Claire sensed the human element. Grace had been vibrant, driven, and kind-hearted, like Emily. She had sought to use her art to help her family, much as Emily had pursued music. Thornton had identified vulnerabilities, familial debt, social isolation, financial desperation, and manipulated them with cold precision. Claire's fingers hovered over the letters, imagining the young artist's final moments, the serene lake surface hiding a tragedy orchestrated by a man who saw women only as vessels for his gain. The realization deepened Claire's determination. This was no ordinary story of fortune hunting. This was a systematic cycle of coercion, isolation, and elimination. Emily had been the first, Grace the second, each death a calculated step in Thornton's long game. Claire felt a moral urgency pressing against the boundaries of history and archives. These women had existed, lived and dreamed, only to be erased by cruelty and pretense. Claire began compiling comparative charts, timelines and correspondence, noting patterns in Thornton's methods. The European sojourns, the rapid marriages, the isolating of his wives, each element mirrored Emily's experience. She knew she had to continue the investigation, uncovering Thornton's next victim, Catherine Price of Philadelphia, and following the trail that would eventually expose the full scope of his deadly pattern. Next, Claire would reconstruct Catherine Price's story, revealing how the cycle of manipulation and fatal accidents extended across cities and family, solidifying the terrifying reality of Robert Thornton's predation. Claire's attention turned to Philadelphia, where Robert Thornton's pattern continued with Catherine Price. Unlike his previous wives, Catherine had already been engaged to a promising young journalist before her family's textile business collapsed. Letters and business records indicated mounting financial pressure. Her family had faced bankruptcy and foreclosure, leaving them vulnerable to Thornton's calculated intervention. Claire traced Catherine's life through society pages, archival correspondence and legal filings, piecing together the portrait of a woman both intelligent and compassionate, yet caught in circumstances beyond her control. Thornton's courtship mirrored earlier patterns, appearing as a financial savior, charming, articulate, persuasive. Catherine, like Emily and Grace, had little room to resist. Her family's debts loomed like a shadow over any personal choice, and Thornton presented a solution that disguised coercion as opportunity. Claire's research uncovered diary fragments from Catherine's closest friend, noting Catherine's excitement about the prospect of traveling to San Francisco with her new husband, tempered by subtle unease. The entries hinted at fear, small observations of Thornton's controlling nature, the way he lingered too long on decisions or subtly dismissed her opinions. Claire followed the couple's movements through travel documents. Their European trip, brief and poorly recorded in passenger manifests, mirrored the isolation Thornton had imposed on Emily and Grace. Then, as with the previous victims, the trail went cold. Claire scoured newspapers, letters, and consulate records, discovering the chilling final entry. Catherine Price had fallen from a hotel balcony in San Francisco within months of her marriage. Officially deemed an accident, the circumstances bore the unmistakable signature of Thornton's manipulation. Claire's research illuminated the deliberate structure behind the deaths. Each woman had been removed from familial oversight, transported abroad or to unfamiliar cities, then isolated until tragedy struck. The accidents were plausible, socially and legally defensible, yet the pattern could no longer be ignored. Catherine's manuscripts and essays, lost in the aftermath, represented another stolen future, another life extinguished for financial and social gain. Claire imagined Thornton watching, calculating, ensuring the deaths could be recorded as misfortune rather than consequence. The emotional impact weighed heavily on Claire. Catherine, like Emily and Grace, had been vibrant and talented, yet her potential had been erased. Claire meticulously documented each detail, the timeline, the locations, the familial circumstances, and the methodical approach Thornton had employed. This woman, this bright and promising writer, had been sacrificed in the same cruel calculus of wealth and manipulation. Claire felt a growing responsibility not only to record the facts, but to give Catherine, like the others, her humanity back. Claire's notes began to reveal more than isolated tragedies. They formed a roadmap of systematic abuse, exposing the intersection of wealth, social obligation, and gendered vulnerability in early 20th century America. Thornton's pattern was clear, predictable, and deadly. Identify a family in distress, court the daughter under the guise of assistance, isolate, and let tragedy do the rest. Each death masked by society's assumptions about propriety, the invisibility of women's suffering, and legal loopholes favoring male authority. As Claire concluded her research on Catherine, she understood the urgency of the final case. Helen Bradford of Baltimore would be Thornton's last documented victim, the woman whose death would ultimately attract scrutiny yet still follow the same sinister blueprint. Claire braced herself, knowing the story of Helen would complete the portrait of Thornton's cruelty and illuminate the full scale of a killer operating under the guise of social ruses. Claire turned her focus to Baltimore, where Helen Bradford's story unfolded as the final piece of Robert Thornton's deadly puzzle. Unlike the previous victims, Helen came from a family with legal acumen. Her father was a prominent attorney. Claire's research into court records, family correspondence, and social columns painted a portrait of a young woman intelligent, compassionate, and principled, yet placed under immense pressure by financial and social expectations. Her family's resources were stretched thin, and Thornton's arrival coincided perfectly with their vulnerabilities. Documents revealed Thornton's methodical approach. He courted Helen aggressively, emphasizing his financial stability and promising relief from the family's burdens. Claire read letters from Helen to her friends, subtle notes that hinted at unease, her hesitation, the quiet fear in her words, her awareness that Thornton's charm masked something darker. Unlike Catherine or Grace, Helen voiced concern to her family, noting that she felt manipulated, even frightened by his intensity. Her father, despite these warnings, reluctantly approved the union, swayed by Thornton's apparent capacity to resolve the family's financial straits. The wedding, like the others, was swift and discreet. Claire traced the records of Helen's marriage to Thornton, noting the similarities to Emily, Grace, and Catherine: rapid courtship, removal from familiar surroundings, and immediate isolation under the guise of honeymoon travel. Letters sent to her father were intercepted or explained away by Thornton as lost in the mail, a familiar tactic designed to sever familial oversight. Claire sensed the calculated control, the meticulous planning that enabled Thornton to manipulate not only the women, but also their families. Within months, tragedy struck again. Helen's death was officially recorded as a fall down a staircase in Tosu, her Manhattan home in 1916. Newspaper accounts labeled it an accident, tragic yet plausible. Claire compared the circumstances with the previous deaths. Young, wealthy women, recently married, isolated and deceased, under circumstances that appeared accidental, yet followed a chilling pattern. The consistency left no doubt. Thornton was a serial predator, exploiting social expectations, legal gaps, and gendered vulnerabilities to conceal his crimes. What set Helen apart was the brief spark of resistance. Family records indicated that she had confided her fear to her father, demanding protection and intervention. For the first time, public scrutiny was applied, as her father demanded an inquest. Even then, society and legal structures failed her. The jury ruled her death accidental, despite clear warning signs. Claire felt the weight of systemic failure pressing through the historical record, the societal constraints, gender norms, and legal loopholes that allowed a predator like Thornton to act with impunity. As Claire documented Helen's life, she reconstructed her aspirations. Helen had been a volunteer teacher, deeply invested in immigrant children, eager to make a tangible difference in her community. The woman's courage, empathy, and intellect had been extinguished, erased by a man who saw her only as a vehicle for wealth. Claire's notes captured the human cost of Thornton's predation, the pattern of isolation, coercion, and death repeated across multiple cities and families. By the end of her research on Helen, Claire understood the complete scope of Thornton's cycle. 4 women, Emily, Grace, Catherine, and Helen, each had been vibrant, talented, and full of promise, yet all were consumed by the same calculated cruelty. Claire's task now extended beyond historical reconstruction. She had a moral obligation to preserve their stories, restoring identity and humanity to the lives Thornton had destroyed. Next, Claire would begin piecing together the exhibition that would finally reveal the full pattern, ensuring that the 4 women would be remembered not as victims of. Claire sat surrounded by mountains of research, letters, death certificates, newspaper clippings, travel manifests, and photographs. Each piece, when examined in isolation, appeared mundane, routine even, but together they revealed a sinister rhythm, a pattern meticulously orchestrated by Robert Thornton. She began mapping timelines, overlaying the lives of Emily, Grace, Catherine and Helen against his movements, business dealings, and the locations of their deaths. The pattern was undeniable. Thornton's method followed a chilling formula. Identify a wealthy family under financial pressure, present himself as the savior, the solution to debts and social obligations, court the daughter with charm, patience, and persuasion, isolate her from familial oversight through travel or relocation, maintain strict control over communication, intercept letters, manipulate circumstances, and finally, ensure her death is recorded as a plausible accident. The cycle repeated across cities, New Orleans, Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, and across continents from Europe to America. Each tragedy had been carefully concealed under the guise of propriety, the perfect veneer of societal respectability hiding an orchestrated pattern of predation. Claire felt a cold shiver as she traced Thornton's steps. In each case, there were early warning signs that family, friends, and society ignored or were powerless to act upon. Emily's veil, heavy and concealing, her tears captured in a single moment of photographic evidence. Grace's watercolors, abruptly sold posthumously, hinting at confiscated creativity. Catherine's manuscripts lost in a San Francisco hotel balcony accident, her intellectual promise erased. Helen's staircase fall, scrutinized yet ruled accidental despite her father's pleas. The repetition of control, isolation, and fatal accidents painted a portrait of a man who viewed women as disposable objects to be used, consumed, and discarded. Claire began drafting a visual representation of the pattern. Maps, timelines, annotated portraits, travel records, and family trees combined into a stark mosaic. Each line, each connection, told a story of manipulation and systemic failure. What was remarkable, she realized, was not just Thornton's cruelty, but the social and legal structures that enabled it. Laws prioritized male authority, social norms discouraged interference in private marital affairs, wealth insulated predators from scrutiny. The tragedy of these four women lay not only in Thornton's predation, but in the complicity of a society unwilling or unable to recognize and respond. In the quiet of the archive, Claire allowed herself a moment of reflection. She pictured Emily at 10, laughing, playing piano, dreaming of Paris. Grace, hunched over her watercolors, painting landscapes that would never see the world. Catherine, writing poetry and essays, her voice silenced before it could fully develop. Helen, tending to immigrant children, her compassion cut short. Each woman had been vibrant, talented, full of life, now reduced to dates, causes of death, and faded photographs in archival boxes. Claire's determination solidified. She would transform this research into more than a historical account. She would craft an exhibition, a narrative that revealed the full scale of Thornton's crimes, the systemic failures that allowed him to operate undetected, and the humanity of the women whose lives were stolen. Their stories would no longer be silent. Their voices, once suppressed by fear, manipulation, and societal neglect, would finally be heard. Next, Claire would begin curating the exhibition, ensuring that each detail, the photographs, letters, journals, and documents, would illuminate not only Thornton's cruelty, but the resilience and individuality of his victims. The wedding portrait that once concealed terror would become the centerpiece of truth. Claire spent days in the New Orleans Historical Collection, surrounded by decades of archived documents, photographs, and artifacts. Her goal was clear: transform the accumulated research into an exhibition that told the complete story of Robert Thornton's crimes and, more importantly, the lives of the women he destroyed. Each object needed careful consideration, each photograph a voice demanding to be heard. She began with Emily DeVue's wedding portrait. The image had haunted her since the moment she first enhanced it, revealing the tears streaking down Emily's cheeks and the bruise hidden beneath the heavy veil. Claire positioned it as the centerpiece, a visual testament to fear captured in a society's most celebratory moment. Beside it, she placed Jean-Baptiste Lavau's original journal entry, its flowing handwriting chronicling the photographer's unease, his silent witness to Emily's terror. The pairing created a dialogue across time, the silent cry of the bride and the record of an observer trapped by social constraints. Next, Claire arranged letters and personal items recovered from Grace Worthington, Catherine Price, and Helen Bradford. Grace's watercolors were displayed in delicate frames, her brushstrokes conveying a talent abruptly cut short. Catherine's surviving manuscripts and poems were reproduced and placed in protective cases. The ink faded, but her intellect and empathy still palpable. Helen's correspondence with her father and friends revealed subtle pleas for protection, evidence of her awareness of danger, her attempts to resist Thornton's control. Claire noticed that when arranged together, the women's artifacts created a haunting tapestry, lives brimming with potential, each intersecting with the same predator, each story a thread severed too soon. The exhibition layout emphasized context as much as content. Maps traced Thornton's movements across sea, ties and continents. Timelines illustrated the sequence of marriages and deaths, and infographics highlighted patterns of isolation, manipulation, and fatal accidents. Claire ensured that visitors could see not just the outcomes, but the mechanisms of coercion, the societal structures that allowed a wealthy, socially connected man to operate with impunity. It was a lesson in history and a reflection on human behavior, both then and now. Claire incorporated modern technology into the display. Digital enhancements of Emily's wedding portrait allowed viewers to zoom in on every detail: the veil's intricate lace, the tears, the bruise, and the subtle tension in her posture. Audio excerpts of journal readings and letters provided a haunting soundtrack, giving voice to the women's fear, hope, and suppressed resistance. Each visitor could experience both the intimacy of private tragedy and the broader patterns of abuse and societal complicity. Finally, Claire added a dedicated section addressing domestic violence, bridging historical cases with contemporary issues. Information about resources, support systems, and advocacy organizations reinforced the exhibition's relevance, connecting the lives of Emily, Grace, Catherine, and Helen to the ongoing struggles many face today. She wanted the women remembered not just as victims, but as catalysts for understanding and change. As the final elements were placed, Claire stepped back and surveyed the exhibition. The weight of history, injustice, and suppressed voices pressed around her. Yet within that gravity was a profound sense of purpose. These women, once silenced, would now speak. Their lives, their talents, and their suffering would educate, haunt, and inspire those who came to see, ensuring that Robert Thornton's calculated cruelty would never again go unnoticed. Next, Claire would prepare for the exhibition's opening, anticipating the moment when descendants and the public would finally witness the full truth. The evening air was thick with anticipation as Claire walked through the grand halls of the New Orleans Historical Collection. The exhibition, months in the making, was finally ready to reveal the lives and tragedies of Emily DeVoe, Grace Worthington, Catherine Price, and Helen Bradford. Velvet ropes cordoned off displays, spotlights illuminated artifacts, and walls were adorned with enlarged, enhanced photographs capturing moments long hidden in shadows. The atmosphere was electric, yet somber, a mingling of curiosity, grief, and respect. Guests began to arrive: historians, journalists, local society members, and families who had descended from the women whose stories now filled the rooms. Many had never met, yet they shared an unspoken bond, a connection to lives stolen by one man's calculated cruelty. Descendants whispered quietly, examining artifacts, tracing maps, reading letters, and feeling a strange mix of pride and sorrow. Claire moved among them, observing reactions, noting tears, gasps, and moments of silent reflection. Each response reaffirmed the exhibition's purpose. These women would no longer be invisible. At the center of the main hall stood Emily DeVoe's wedding portrait. The veil, once meant to conceal her fear and the bruise beneath it, now revealed every detail. Visitors leaned in to examine the digital enhancements that made the tears and bruising unmistakable. Jean-Baptiste Lavo's journal entry was displayed beside the portrait, describing the photographer's witnessing of Emily's distress and his helplessness in the face of societal constraints. Many lingered there, silent, absorbing the intensity of a single captured moment that spoke volumes about fear, coercion, and injustice. Claire noticed a woman standing motionless before Emily's portrait, her hands trembling as she clutched a faded photograph. There was something profoundly familiar in the way she gazed at the image, her eyes reflecting generations of unspoken pain. Gathering her courage, Claire approached. I'm Claire Duchamp, curator of the exhibition. Can I help you? The woman turned slowly, her expression filled with tears and a mixture of awe and relief. My name is Marie de Vaux-Laurent, she said, voice quivering. Emily was my great-great-aunt. I never knew her story. She had been erased from our family history. Marie revealed the photograph she carried. A portrait of Emily as a young girl, bright-eyed and smiling, full of life and innocence. Claire felt the weight of that moment. Here was proof of Emily, before her life had been overshadowed by Thornton's cruelty. A reminder of the person she had been, her dreams and talents intact. Marie entrusted Claire with the photograph, agreeing it should be displayed alongside the wedding portrait, creating a striking before and after comparison that would resonate deeply with visitors. As the evening unfolded, more descendants came forward, sharing personal artifacts, letters, and memories of the women. Grace Worthington's watercolors, Catherine Price's manuscripts, and Helen Bradford's letters were added to the exhibition, enriching the narrative and humanizing the victims beyond historical records. Visitors were captivated, many moved to tears, as the stories of resilience, talent, and courage emerged amidst tragedy. The opening reception became more than an unveiling. It was a gathering of remembrance, healing, and acknowledgement. Claire watched as families and historians connected, sharing stories whispered through generations. For the first time, the lives of Emily, Grace, Catherine, and Helen were recognized not merely as tragedies, but as full, meaningful existences whose voices were finally being heard. Next, Claire would reflect on the exhibition's impact, tracing the ripple effects on descendants, historians, and the broader community. In the days following the exhibition's opening, Claire began to witness the quiet, powerful effects of her work. News outlets covered the story, highlighting Emily de Vaux' wedding portrait and the other victims' narratives. The exhibition was no longer just a local attraction. It had become a national conversation about forgotten histories, domestic violence, and the ways society had allowed abuse to remain hidden. Scholars and journalists reached out, requesting interviews, archival access, and permission to reproduce images for academic and educational purposes. Claire was struck by how one photograph, enhanced and contextualized, could ignite discussion across decades. Emails poured in from descendants who had never known their family's past. Some were cautious, hesitant to engage with stories of trauma, yet compelled by a need to understand the truths their families had never spoken of. One woman, a descendant of Grace Worthington, sent an old sketchbook containing previously unseen watercolors. Another, related to Catherine Price, forwarded photocopies of poems and essays long thought lost. Each contribution deepened the narrative, painting the women as more than victims. They were artists, thinkers, and compassionate individuals, full of potential, brutally curtailed. Claire also noted a shift in visitor behavior at the exhibition. People lingered longer before the portraits, reading not just the factual accounts, but also the personal stories, letters, and artifacts. Conversations arose about systemic failures and the cultural norms that had allowed men like Robert Thornton to act with impunity. Teachers requested guided tours for students, emphasizing historical empathy, critical thinking, and awareness of abuse across time. Domestic violence organizations cited the exhibition as an educational resource, connecting historical cases to contemporary issues and advocacy. Amid the public recognition, Claire herself reflected on the emotional toll. Working through the lives of 4 women destroyed by calculated cruelty left her drained but resolute. She understood that her role extended beyond curation. She had become a guardian of their memories. Each artifact she handled, each journal entry transcribed, and each enhanced photograph revealed layers of pain and resistance. Yet there was also resilience, courage, and the subtle evidence of women who had tried, in small ways, to assert their agency despite overwhelming forces. One afternoon, Claire received a letter from a historian in Boston who had been following her research. He expressed astonishment at the thorough reconstruction of the victims' lives and commented on the exhibition's ability to humanize history. Too often, he wrote, women are reduced to footnotes in criminal histories or statistics in social analyses. Your work gives them depth, dignity, and voice. Claire read the words repeatedly, feeling a mix of pride and sorrow. She knew the stories were painful, yet she recognized their transformative potential. The ripple effect extended even further when descendants began sharing the exhibition's findings with their families. Long-buried stories emerged. Photographs were discovered in attics, letters were found tucked in boxes, and oral histories passed down through generations were finally recorded. In homes across New Orleans, Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, families were piecing together histories that had been deliberately hidden or conveniently forgotten. Claire realized that her work had sparked a collective act of remembrance, bridging past and present, and giving new life to silenced voices. Yet amidst this growing recognition, one question lingered. Had they uncovered the full extent of Thornton's crimes? Were there more victims whose stories remained buried? Claire knew that understanding the past fully was a pursuit without end, and she prepared to delve even deeper into the shadows Thornton had left behind. Next, Claire would investigate Robert T. Claire's investigation into Robert Harrison Thornton had begun as a personal pursuit, but now it demanded meticulous research across cities, countries, and decades. Records, manifests, and newspaper archives were her tools, each document a fragment in a puzzle spanning continents. She knew that if there were other victims, their stories might be scattered in the shadows, lost to history unless someone carefully pieced them together. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she accessed digitized Boston newspapers from the early 1900s. Every social column, engagement announcement, and business notice became a potential clue. Thornton's pattern was consistent yet calculated. He identified wealthy families in financial distress, ingratiated himself with fathers desperate to maintain status or cover debts, and married daughters whose lives he intended to control. Claire mapped the marriages she already knew: Emily DeVoe in New Orleans, Grace Worthington in New York, Catherine Price in Philadelphia, and Helen Bradford in Baltimore. Each union ended in tragedy within 2 years, often abroad or far from the woman's support system. Yet there were gaps, years and locations that remained unaccounted for, brief absences that might conceal other marriages, other deaths. Claire's next step was transatlantic research. Passenger manifests revealed Robert Thornton's movements, documenting trips to Europe where he had ostensibly traveled for business or leisure. Yet each arrival and departure carried a hint of secrecy. He would vanish for months, reappear in new cities, sometimes under the same name, sometimes using subtle variations. The trail was fragmented, but patterns emerged when she cross-referenced dates with obituaries, death certificates, and legal notices. One anomaly in a French newspaper caught her eye: a brief mention of an American woman who had died in a villa accident en Nice in 1906, matching Emily DeVoe's recorded death. The details aligned perfectly with her previous findings, confirming Claire's theory that Thornton's method extended across borders. Determined to uncover more, Claire contacted Elizabeth Parker, the genealogy researcher in London who specialized in American expatriates in Edwardian Europe. Parker shared records that illuminated Thornton's European travels between 1905 and 1910, including property rentals, hotel registrations, and civil documents filed under his name. Each entry hinted at women accompanying him, young brides from wealthy American families whose subsequent fates were obscured by time and distance. Claire realized that this predator had exploited not just wealth, but the limitations of record-keeping and communication in the early 20th century. The more she uncovered, the more chilling the pattern became. Letters from relatives, brief society mentions, and sparse death records revealed additional women who had disappeared, died suddenly, or been quietly buried. Some were documented as accidents, falls from balconies or staircases, or drownings, all consistent with Thornton's established modus operandi. He had operated with impunity, shielded by wealth, social connections, and societal assumptions that the deaths of wives were accidents. No one questioned him. No one intervened. Claire mapped the full scope of his operations, noting the cities, dates, and families affected. New Orleans, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York. Each location revealed a repeated pattern of manipulation and destruction. The predator was methodical, ruthless, and extraordinarily careful, leaving behind only traces for the patient investigator to discover. Yet despite the horror, Claire felt a strange sense of purpose. Each piece of evidence brought her closer to giving voice to the silenced, restoring dignity to lives that had been erased. Her next challenge would be to trace potential victims who had been lost completely to history, whose names and fates had never been recorded or associated with Thornton. This meant reaching out to archives, local historical societies, and even families who might have unknowingly held fragments of his predation in private collections. Claire knew the task would test both her resolve and her patience, but the women deserved that effort, and she was determined not to let their stories remain buried. Next, Claire would uncover the first of these hidden victims, piecing together a life that had vanished from official records, leaving only whispers in time. Claire had been tracing Robert Thornton's movements for weeks when a fragile lead emerged from the dusty archives of Philadelphia's Historical Society. Amid stacks of business records and personal diaries, she found mention of a young woman, Eleanor Whitman, whose sudden disappearance in 1907 had been quietly noted in a local newspaper but never fully explained. Her family had been prominent, yet not wealthy enough to attract extensive national attention. The article described Eleanor as missing after brief European travels with her husband, a phrase that chilled Claire as she read it aloud. The husband's name was obscured, but cross-referencing travel manifests and shipping records revealed the familiar pattern. Eleanor had boarded the SS Lusitania in early spring of 1907 with a man whose details matched Thornton's known movements. The parallels with previous victims were immediate. Eleanor, like Emily DeVoe and the others, had been described as intelligent, accomplished, and gentle. A young woman with a promising life, curtailed by circumstances beyond her control. Claire scoured the family papers preserved in the Philadelphia archives. Letters from Eleanor's mother hinted at financial pressures that had made her family receptive to the allure of a wealthy suitor, though no direct mention of Thornton appeared. The omissions themselves were telling. Silence, often imposed by fear or social pressure, had concealed Eleanor's plight from public scrutiny. Determined to reconstruct her story, Claire consulted shipping logs, French consular records, and newspapers from coastal cities in Europe. Each record placed Eleanor in the same timeline and trajectory as Thornton's other victims. The trail led to Nice, where she had reportedly died in what was officially recorded as a tragic accident, falling from a villa terrace in early autumn 1907. The details mirrored Emily DeVoe's death almost exactly, down to the small plot purchased by her husband in the local Protestant cemetery. Claire felt a knot tighten in her chest. Eleanor had been effectively erased, reduced to a footnote in a city ledger and a brief mention in a society column. Claire's resolve strengthened. She understood now that Thornton's pattern was not merely opportunistic. It was systematic, calculated, and repeated across families who lacked the power or awareness to question his intentions. Each hidden victim represented a story of hope extinguished, lives redirected toward despair and death. Eleanor's letters, preserved in a trunk of family papers, offered glimpses of her personality, her love of literature, her playful correspondence with a childhood friend, and the subtle expressions of her anxiety before leaving for Europe. These small, intimate details transformed Eleanor from an anonymous casualty into a human being, vivid and present across the decades. The challenge now was presenting Eleanor's story alongside the other victims without repeating events unnecessarily. Claire envisioned an exhibition that layered the women's lives, showing connections of tragedy while preserving the individuality of each narrative. Eleanor's story would add nuance, revealing not only the calculated cruelty of Thornton, but also the broader societal forces that allowed him to operate undetected. As Claire documented Eleanor's life letters and death records, she realized the importance of naming her fully, giving her presence back in history. Each photograph, each transcribed letter became a testimony of existence, resisting the erasure Thornton had relied upon. This hidden victim, once lost to the shadows of time, would finally have her story told, ensuring that Eleanor Whitman, like Emily DeVoe, Grace Worthington, Catherine Price, and Helen Bradford, would be remembered as a woman whose life mattered. Next, Claire would uncover the intricate connections between Thornton's victims and the families who unknowingly facilitated his schemes, exposing the systemic vulnerabilities that in Abbey's. Claire knew that Robert Thornton's crimes were not just the acts of a single man, they were enabled by families desperate to maintain wealth and status. To understand the full scope of his predation, she needed to examine the pressures, decisions, and complicity of the families who had allowed him access to their daughters. Each case revealed patterns of financial vulnerability, social ambition, and cultural expectations that, combined, created a perfect environment for exploitation. The DeVoe family of New Orleans, for instance, had been reeling from failed sugar harvests and mounting debts. Claire meticulously combed through property records, loan documents, and family letters, discovering that Henri DeVoe had taken a substantial loan from a Boston financial firm, one in which Thornton had a stake, just months before Emily's wedding. It became clear that Thornton had engineered a transaction disguised as financial assistance, binding the family to him while acquiring Emily as his bride. Claire felt a shiver as she realized the transactional nature of the marriage. Emily had been treated as collateral in a financial arrangement, her safety subordinated to the family's desperation. Moving north, Claire turned to the Worthingtons of New York. Grace Worthington's father had been struggling to keep his family afloat after a bank failure wiped out their fortune. Letters from Grace to friends revealed her anxiety over Thornton's sudden appearance, though social norms demanded that she maintain composure and obedience. Her parents, eager to regain financial stability, encouraged the courtship, unintentionally facilitating Thornton's manipulations. Claire noted the recurring motif. Fathers who believed they were safeguarding their families' futures were, in fact, entrusting their daughters to a predator. Philadelphia's Price family offered another example. Catherine Price had been engaged to a young journalist, but when her family's textile business collapsed, creditors threatened foreclosure. Thornton inserted himself into the family's affairs, offering to settle debts and arrange marriages. Claire discovered legal filings indicating how financial desperation and societal pressures coerced families into choices that disregarded their daughters' autonomy. Each bride, she realized, was constrained by the intersection of law, custom, and economic necessity. Even in Baltimore, Helen Bradford's family had been susceptible. Her father, a prominent attorney, had borrowed money to cover legal expenses during bankruptcy proceedings. Thornton's loans and charm had positioned him as a savior figure, concealing the threat he posed. Claire examined letters from Helen expressing her fears and realized how often these warnings had been ignored, brushed aside as anxiety or propriety, allowing Thornton's methodical cruelty to continue unchecked. The patterns became undeniable. Financial desperation, societal expectations, and paternal authority had repeatedly facilitated Thornton's access to vulnerable women. Claire understood that the broader story wasn't just about a calculating murderer. It was about systemic forces that allowed exploitation to thrive. Wealth and social standing, instead of protecting these young women, had often exposed them to danger. Claire compiled the evidence in meticulous charts, linking each family, financial transaction, and social connection to Thornton's movements. She recognized the moral complexity. The families were neither wholly innocent nor entirely complicit. They were constrained by circumstance, by law, and by the social codes of early 20th century America. Yet their decisions had consequences, and those consequences were fatal. Next, Claire would delve into Thornton's financial schemes, revealing how his manipulation of money, property, and legal loopholes enabled his predation and shielded him from suspicion for over a decade. Claire realized that to fully understand Robert Thornton, she had to examine the financial mechanisms that had enabled his crimes. Each marriage was not only a personal tragedy, but also a meticulously orchestrated transaction, combining wealth, legal loopholes, and the veneer of social respectability. Thornton's ability to manipulate money was as precise as his manipulation of people, and uncovering this web would illuminate why he remained undetected for so long. She began by tracing the loans he had extended to the DeVoe, Worthington, Price, and Bradford families. In every case, the loans appeared generous and necessary, timed perfectly to coincide with a financial crisis. Yet Claire discovered that the contracts included clauses that transferred control over assets to Thornton in the event of default or other contingencies, language that most families would not have fully understood. Legal experts she consulted explained that, in early 20th century America, wealthy men could use marriage and debt instruments to consolidate power over women's inheritances, a loophole Thornton exploited with chilling efficiency. Claire turned next to property records: Emily DeVoe's dowry, Grace Worthington's inheritance, Catherine Price's family home, Helen Bradford's trust. Thornton acquired access to each within months of marriage, often before the bride's death. In some cases, he used legal intermediaries or foreign accounts to conceal the transfer of assets, leaving investigators with no immediate evidence of wrongdoing. Every transaction was clean on paper, yet each served the same purpose: enriching Thornton while isolating his wives. Shipping manifests and travel logs revealed another layer of financial control. Claire discovered that Thornton often insisted his wives travel abroad immediately after marriage under the pretext of extended honeymoons or cultural education. These trips were costly, paid for by his own accounts, but Claire realized the strategy was twofold: distance from family and documentation of the wife's compliance, creating a paper trail that could later justify his control. The more isolated the wife, the more dependent she became, and the easier it was for Thornton to orchestrate accidents without scrutiny. Even insurance records contributed to the web. In Grace Worthington's case, Claire found that her life insurance policy had been swiftly transferred to Thornton's name, making her accidental drowning financially advantageous. Catherine Price's sudden fall from a hotel balcony had similar financial consequences, enabling Thornton to claim her assets. Every death, presented as an unfortunate accident, completed a calculated economic cycle. Claire mapped these transactions visually, linking loans, property, insurance, and travel records into a complex diagram. The financial web revealed a pattern. Thornton leveraged money as both lure and weapon, intertwining personal relationships with economic gain. This systemic approach allowed him to evade suspicion while destroying lives. The realization was sobering. Thornton's crimes were not only personal betrayals, but also deliberate exploitation of structural inequalities that left women vulnerable and families complicit, whether knowingly or through circumstance. As Claire studied the chart, she felt a chilling clarity. Thornton's genius lay not in physical violence, but in the exploitation of societal and financial systems, a predator who weaponized the very structures meant to safeguard families. The women he married had been trapped, not by chance, but by an intricately engineered network of coercion, debt, and social expectation. Next, Claire would investigate the international dimensions of Thornton's operations, uncovering how European connections, travel, and our legal systems enabled his crimes to remain hidden from American authorities. Claire's research revealed that Robert Thornton's operations extended far beyond the United States. Each marriage was followed by a carefully orchestrated European journey, ostensibly for culture, leisure, or education. Yet as she traced passenger manifests, hotel records, and society columns across France, England, and Italy, a disturbing pattern emerged. Thornton leveraged distance, unfamiliarity, and foreign jurisdictions to ensure his wives remained isolated and invisible. The SS Britannic's manifest had been the first clue. Emily DeVoe and Robert Thornton's passage from New York to Liverpool was listed as part of a continental tour, a vague term that masked months of calculated travel. Claire discovered that Thornton had carefully chosen destinations with minimal American oversight, small towns or private villas where he could maintain control without the interference of family or authorities. In each location, he rented luxurious accommodations in secluded areas, ensuring the women's movements were limited and interactions with locals carefully monitored. Claire turned her attention to financial records abroad. Emily's inheritance had been redirected through European banks under Thornton's name, a maneuver that shielded the assets from DeVoe family oversight. Similarly, Grace Worthington's insurance policy had been registered with a London-based firm, and Catherine Price's property documents were quietly transferred through an Italian notary. These transactions were legitimate on paper, but they effectively placed his wives' wealth entirely under his control while they were abroad. Each country's legal system, unfamiliar to the women and their families, created layers of protection for Thornton. Even correspondence was manipulated. Claire found letters from European hotels and travel agents, many bearing notes indicating that communications to the wives were to be screened or delayed. Emily's letters, for example, were intercepted by her husband before leaving the villa in Nice. He controlled who received information, further isolating his victims. Claire realized that Thornton had anticipated every potential route for news or escape, using bureaucracy and geography as weapons. Society columns offered another grim confirmation. Brief mentions of the Thorntons attending receptions, balls, and dinners painted an image of cultured American expatriates, seemingly ordinary members of elite European circles. Yet Claire discovered that these appearances were staged, superficial engagements meant to uphold an illusion of respectability. In reality, the women were confined to private residences, their autonomy limited, their lives controlled. Thornton's European social connections, bankers, landlords, and society figures, unwittingly aided him, providing credibility and invisibility. Claire's research also uncovered a chilling trend. Insurance payouts, property transfers, and legal filings in Europe consistently followed incidents labeled as accidental. Emily's fatal fall from the villa balcony in Nice, Grace's drowning in Lake Como, and Catherine's fall from a San Francisco hotel balcony after returning briefly to the US were all preceded by carefully arranged isolation and control abroad. Thornton's knowledge of local systems, coupled with American legal gaps, allowed him to orchestrate these deaths without detection. As Claire mapped these international movements, she saw the terrifying scale of Thornton's planning. He had transformed marriage and travel into tools of confinement and predation, exploiting distance and jurisdiction to render his victims invisible to anyone who might intervene. The pattern was now undeniable. Thornton was not merely a fortune hunter, he was a calculating predator who combined psychological, finances, and geographic manipulation to secure both wealth and impunity. Next, Claire would examine the psychological methods Thornton employed, revealing how fear, coercion, and charm intertwined to subjugate. Claire realized that understanding Robert Thornton's crimes required more than tracking money and travel. It required delving into the psychological mechanisms he used to dominate and silence his wives. Each marriage had a similar trajectory, revealing a carefully honed strategy designed to strip women of autonomy while maintaining the appearance of propriety. She began with Emily DeVoe, whose wedding portrait had first drawn her attention. The heavy veil, the frozen expression, the subtle bruise, all signs of coercion captured in a single image. Claire saw that Thornton's control combined subtle intimidation with social and legal leverage. He cultivated an image of wealth, charm, and social credibility, allowing him to lull families into compliance. Once married, he used isolation, strict routines, and constant oversight to reinforce dependence, exploiting both emotional vulnerability and societal norms that limited women's agency. Letters from Emily, Grace, Catherine, and Helen, rediscovered through descendants and archives, revealed consistent patterns of fear and hesitation. Emily wrote of sleepless nights, of a shadowed presence in her home, and of being watched constantly. Grace confided her unease with European servants, noting that her husband gently corrected her missteps. Catherine expressed frustration at being forbidden to meet old friends or pursue writing. Helen described the quiet terror of an impending visit from her father and the anxiety of explaining her husband's behavior while abroad. Each note, though sparse, illustrated Thornton's ability to manipulate both private and public spaces to maintain control. Claire also noted the calculated alternation between charm and intimidation. In public, Thornton was courteous, attentive, and socially polished. At home or in private settings, he was exacting, imposing, and psychologically coercive. His method ensured that his wives felt trapped, yet unable to resist openly. Fear, shame, and the perception of obligation, family, societal expectation, and legal contract created an invisible cage. Even attempts at protest or escape were met with veiled threats, swift financial or social repercussions, or strategic relocations abroad, removing potential allies. Psychological isolation extended to the use of domestic staff. In Emily's villa in Nice and in Grace's Lake Como residence, servants were instructed to observe and report on her behavior. Any suggestion of disobedience or communication with family was subtly discouraged or prevented. Claire realized that the women's daily lives were surveilled, their routines controlled down to meals, exercise, and correspondence. Thornton had weaponized both household and social networks to reinforce compliance. Beyond fear and surveillance, Claire saw Thornton's use of documentation as a control tool. The wedding portrait of Emily, the journal entries of Jean-Baptiste Lavaux, and the subsequent records of insurance and property transfers demonstrated a pattern of silent coercion. By ensuring legal and financial dominance, he limited avenues for intervention. Even decades later, these mechanisms allowed the story to remain hidden until Claire's investigation revealed the pattern. Claire understood the scope of his methods. Financial leverage, legal manipulation, isolation, social credibility, and psychological dominance. Each element worked in concert, making escape or resistance nearly impossible. Thornton's brilliance lay in integrating these tools seamlessly, appearing benevolent while orchestrating devastation. Next, Claire would explore how she could uncover the remaining traces of Emily DeVoe's brief life abroad, following her final months and the circumstances leading to her untimely death, bringing hidden details into focus. Claire turned her attention to the final months of Emily DeVoe's life in Nice, determined to reconstruct the period that had remained a mystery for over a century. The passenger manifest had placed her and Robert Thornton in France by July 1904, but beyond that, her movements and experiences were largely undocumented. Yet by cross-referencing municipal records, hotel registries, and subtle society mentions, Claire began to piece together a timeline that was both illuminating and horrifying. The villa in which the Thorntons stayed belonged to a minor noble family who had leased it to wealthy expatriates during the summer months. Claire discovered rental contracts and correspondence showing that Thornton had specifically requested privacy, specifying that the household staff must limit interactions with outsiders. The arrangement allowed him complete control over Emily's daily schedule, social contacts, and even her correspondence. Claire noted a recurring entry in the villa's ledger. Madame Thornton observed to remain in quarters during afternoons per Mr. Thornton's request. Simple documentation, but to Claire it revealed an invisible cage imposed on Emily. Letters sent to her parents in New Orleans were intercepted by Thornton or left unopened. Claire uncovered fragments of intercepted communications stored in the villa archives, faint pencil notes suggesting Emily had attempted to write about her fear and discomfort, but was discouraged from sending the letters. One partial letter read, "I wish I could tell Mother. I fear that..." And then the remaining lines were scratched out or never mailed. The pattern was unmistakable. Thornton's control extended beyond physical confinement, reaching into the very words she could communicate. Claire also examined local hospital and medical records. Emily had visited a physician twice during her stay, reporting dizziness, anxiety, and unexplained bruising, notes that matched the bruise documented in the wedding portrait. The physician's notes, neutral in tone, reflected a failure of intervention, indicative of the era's blind trust in the authority of husbands. Claire realized that Emily's plight was simultaneously visible and invisible. Traces existed, yet were dismissed, ignored, or rationalized. The critical breakthrough came when Claire discovered court and property filings related to Thornton's European finances. These documents showed that Emily had signed over portions of her inheritance, legally and under duress, as part of routine financial management under her husband's supervision. Her autonomy was legally stripped, her wealth consolidated under Thornton's control, and her ability to act independently severely constrained. Finally, Claire examined the coroner's report and local police documentation regarding Emily's death in January 1906. The official story, a fatal fall from the villa balcony, was consistent with the typical pattern Thornton would employ. But Claire noticed small, overlooked details. The balcony railing was unusually low, the edge near a decorative planter had been wet, and no witnesses reported seeing her climb or lean over. Combined with prior medical notes and intercepted letters, a grim picture emerged. Emily's death was facilitated by the very environment her husband controlled, a cruel orchestration disguised as accident. By compiling these fragmented records, Claire reconstructed Emily's last months with heartbreaking clarity. She had been isolated, monitored, denied communication, pressured to relinquish her inheritance, and ultimately left in a setting that made her accidental death all but inevitable. The veil in the wedding portrait, once thought a mere stylistic choice, had been an early signal of the terror, a silent plea captured for posterity. Next, Claire would trace Thornton's subsequent victims, showing how his methods evolved yet remained consistent, each life extinguished by a combination of manipulation, isolation, and opportunistic cruelty. Claire's work had brought her to the final chapter of the story, yet it was not an ending defined by tragedy alone. The lives of Emily DeVoe, Grace Worthington, Catherine Price, and Helen Bradford were irreversibly shaped by Robert Thornton's calculated cruelty, but Claire knew their stories deserved preservation not just as victims, but as individuals of remarkable talent, ambition, and resilience. She focused on ensuring that history would remember them fully, beyond the shadows cast by a single predatory man. Claire coordinated with the New Orleans Historical Collection to curate a comprehensive exhibition that went far beyond Emily's wedding portrait. It included letters, personal artifacts, and photographs of each woman, alongside the enhanced images revealing tears and bruises beneath the veil. Grace's watercolors, Catherine's unpublished manuscripts, and Helen's letters to friends became central exhibits, illuminating the intellect, creativity, and compassion of women whose lives had been cut short. Claire insisted on contextual materials showing the systemic forces at play: gender norms, legal restrictions, and social expectations that had enabled Thornton's crimes to go unchecked. The exhibition was organized to tell a chronological story. Visitors first encountered Emily DeVoe, her bridal image juxtaposed with a smiling childhood portrait, a powerful contrast illustrating both innocence and the weight of betrayal. Each subsequent section documented the life, marriage, and untimely death of the other victims. Claire made sure to highlight their accomplishments, interests, and personalities, showing them as more than footnotes in a criminal's history. The narrative was reinforced with audio recordings of descendants reading letters and archival music that Emily had loved, giving the exhibition an immersive emotional dimension. Feedback was immediate and profound. Descendants of the four women attended, often meeting each other for the first time. Many shared family stories previously whispered in shame or fear, now validated by Claire's research. The exhibit became a catalyst for recognition and remembrance, transforming abstract tragedy into a tangible human connection. Scholars, journalists, and domestic violence organizations cited it as a model for exploring the intersection of historical abuse, gender, and social inequality. It sparked conversations about how wealth, social status, and patriarchal norms had historically silenced women, while emphasizing the continuity of these struggles into modern society. Claire also used the exhibition as an educational tool. Guided tours highlighted the methods Thornton employed, not sensationalizing the crimes, but emphasizing the subtle coercion, isolation, and manipulation that allowed him to evade justice. Visitors were encouraged to reflect on the resilience of the women, the courage implicit in Emily's silent plea captured in her portrait, and the responsibility of society to recognize and respond to abuse in all its forms. For Claire, the greatest reward was personal. The heavy veil that had once concealed Emily's suffering now symbolized revelation and justice. Tears, bruises, and silent pleas, recorded unintentionally over a century ago, had finally been understood. The women, once reduced to shadows in society's annals, had been restored to full humanity. Their talents, dreams, and voices endured, transformed into lessons, remembrance, and advocacy. Emily DeVoe and her fellow brides were no longer merely victims. They were testament to courage, resilience, and the enduring impact of truth revealed. The exhibition remained a permanent reminder that even in the darkest histories, acknowledgement and remembrance could restore dignity, giving the lost a voice that transcends time. Visitors left with a profound sense of reverence, witnessing not only the consequences of cruelty, but the power of persistence and memory to illuminate lives once hidden in shadow.